Okay, so now I want to turn our attention to the narrative technique in the novel, um, and specifically this idea of free indirect discourse that I introduced last time, that I've referred to in the previous video as a species of third person omniscient narration. But it's something that is slightly adjacent to the third person omniscient narrator. It's doing something more more radical in terms of situating us, forcing us into the consciousness of a character, and blending the voice of the narrator, the sort of otherwise neutral voice or objective voice or authoritative voice of the third person narrator with the consciousness and the style of thinking and the habits of mind that characterize the psyche, the deranged psyche of the character Dix Steele. Um, so as we do this, or before I launch into a sort of discussion of free and direct discourse, both what it means, how it circulates in literature outside of the novel that we're reading, and then how it frames our experience of the novel. This is where it would be a good idea to refer to the PowerPoint and the slide that leads with a definition of free indirect discourse from the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms. It's important that we know specifically what we're talking about, and it's a good resource, the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms, a good resource to sort of fine tune the terminologies that we use to open up texts and illuminate the ways that they work on us as readers and interpreters. So free indirect discourse, and here I'm simply going to read from the slide the definition that I've plucked directly from the Dictionary of Literary Terms. Free indirect discourse is defined here as a manner of presenting the thoughts and utterances of a fictional character as if from that character's point of view, by combining the grammatical and other features of the character's quote-unquote direct speech with features of the narrator's indirect report. Okay, so you might be asking, okay, so what does that mean specifically, and in what ways is that different from third-person omniscient narration? So the third-person omniscient narrator has certain qualities that a third-person limited narrator doesn't have, right? A third-person limited narrator has something like an objective view, but what the third-person limited narrator is limited to is in effect the visible world, the visible material world. I sort of think of, because my mind sort of goes in this direction, I think of third person limited narration as something like a camera perspective. So in the same way that the camera can record very precisely sometimes the external world, the world external to itself, the camera. What it cannot do is penetrate the thinking of individuals that it captures, right? This is what cinema really doesn't do. Cinema can allude to the inner lives of characters, but it does so in a way that we could think of as non-cinematic. Namely, we have something like voiceover narration, which is really not cinematic at all. It's really more literary. Cinema is contained, photography is contained to the visible external material world, and so too is the third person limited narrator. What the third person omniscient narrator can do are, well, a few things. One, often a third person omniscient narrator is not contained to the present moment in which a narrative is set. So a third person omniscient narrator can go back in time periodically, or it can jump forward in time. It can say things like, little did the character know that he would be meeting the woman that 5 years hence he would marry, right? Something like that, where the third person omniscient narrator is all knowing in sort of all senses of the word, that it can kind of go back and forth in time and transcend the limitations of our own location in time and space. The most common thing that the third person omniscient narrator does, the way that it announces itself as omniscient rather than limited, is enter into the thinking of characters, right? but it's not exactly free and direct discourse. So I'll give you an example of the difference between free and direct discourse and third person omniscience, in a story that I've only read for the first time in my life this week, as it turns out, a very famous story, a frequently anthologized story, one that many of you have read. It's a story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by the 19th century American writer Ambrose Bierce. So the story goes like this. So we have at the beginning what appears to be a third-person limited narrator describing a man who is about to be executed. He is standing on Owl Creek Bridge, the noose is around his neck, and he is about to plummet to his death. And so the third-person limited narration gives us a kind of depiction of the scene around this man, but never enters into the thinking of particular characters. Until this moment that I'll read right now. So this is the end of the first part of An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. He unclosed his eyes and saw again the water below him. If I could free my hands, he thought, I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving, I could evade the bullets and, swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods, and get away home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife and little ones are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance. So the insertion of that he thought tells us that this is a third-person omniscient narrator rather than one performing what we're calling free indirect discourse. We have access to the character's thoughts, but the difference between the narrative voice and the internal dialogue of the character is very clearly demarcated. First of all, it's demarcated with quotation marks, right? Quote, if I could free my hands, he thought. And then the insertion of that, he thought. So there's a clear separation between the narrative voice and the interior reflections of the character. So that's third-person omniscient narration. But what's interesting about this story is that it moves from first a limited third-person narration to a third-person omniscient narration, and then picks up on this kind of free indirect discourse thing. So the story, as some of you may know, this man is about to be executed. At the very end of the first section, the sentinel who is performing the execution opens up the trapdoor underneath him. So that's what we're left with at the end. The trapdoor opens, okay? In the second chapter, or the second section of the story, we go back in time where we learn a bunch of things about this man. Like, he was a Confederate soldier. This is a Civil War narrative. He was a Confederate soldier. He attempted to sabotage a Yankee what's the term? A Yankee campaign, and it was a foiled sabotage attempt. He was arrested by the Yankees, apprehended by the Yankees, and now is about to be executed. So this is the second part of the narrative where we learn this about the man. In the third part of the narrative, the narrative voice penetrates in this more radical way than a mere omniscient narrator would do, penetrates the thinking of the character, and what we get is a blending of the third person narrative voice and the reflections, the inner dialogue, the inner life of the character. So this is where we're getting a free indirect discourse. So I'll pick up. As Peyton Farquhar fell straight downward through the bridge, he lost consciousness and was as one already dead. From this state he was awakened, ages later it seemed to him, by the pain of a sharp pressure upon his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Keen, poignant agonies seemed to shoot from his neck downward through every fiber of his body and limbs. And then it goes on. Then all at once, with terrible suddenness, the light about him shot upward with the noise of a loud splash. A frightful roaring was in his ears, and all was dark and cold. The power of thought was restored. He knew that the rope had broken and had fallen into the stream. There was no additional strangulation. The noose about his neck was already suffocating him and kept the water from his lungs. To die of hanging at the bottom of a river, the idea to him seemed ludicrous. So that last sentence, he to die of hanging at the bottom of the river, that sentence is not identified as the thinking of the character. It's not put into quotation marks. We don't get something like, he thought to himself, to die of hanging at the bottom of a river. It's simply inserted as an extension of the narrative voice, the third person omniscient narrative voice. So there's this blending, right? It's presented to us with all of the qualities of the outside narrator, the third person narrator, but what is happening here is the narrator is representing indirectly, freely and indirectly, the discourse of the character, right? And so we get something similar in the texts that I have, or the passages that I have included as examples on the slide. The first one from perhaps the most famous example of free and direct discourse, the sort of defining, the sort of term defining example of free and direct discourse from Jane Austen, this passage from Pride and Prejudice, which I read last time. For the benefit of those of you who weren't in class, I'll just read it again. Mr. Collins received and returned Mrs. Bennet's felicitations with equal pleasure, then proceeded to relate the particulars of their interview, with the result of which he trusted he had every reason to be satisfied, since the refusal which his cousin had steadfastly given him would naturally flow from her bashful modesty and the genuine delicacy of her character. So initially, when the reader encounters this, we think, oh, this is the narrator providing commentary on the scene in this neutral, third-person, objective way. But what the reader who has the ability to pick up on Austen's irony knows is that actually the narrative, the novel, doesn't want you to accept this thing that the narrator has said about Elizabeth Bennet as the kind of authoritative, endorsed position of the novel. When we encounter this bit that reads, the refusal which his cousin had steadfastly given him would naturally flow from her bashful modesty and the genuine delicacy of her character, that is the thinking of Mr. Collins. That is what Mr. Collins is thinking, and the narrator is presenting it to us as though it were its endorsed opinion. But in fact, it's not. It's a penetration into the style of thinking of Mr. Collins. So often, free and direct discourse is used as an ironic tool, as a tool to heighten the irony. The irony is that while the narrator is presenting this to us as though it were an objective, endorsed opinion, we who understand irony know that that's not the case, that there's this sort of separation between what the narrative is asking us to believe and what the novel is asking us to believe, which is that Mr. Collins is a fool. Rather Elizabeth Bennet is not rejecting him out of bashful modesty or the genuine delicacy of her character. This is what Mr. Collins thinks, but it is not what the novel is inviting us to believe. So for us to pick up on this, we need to understand something like irony. Here's another example of free indirect discourse from a great modernist novel, which maybe some of you have read, which is Flaubert's Madame Bovary, one of the great modernist novels of all time. This is another example of free indirect discourse that isn't exactly ironic or funny, but what it is a sort of deep penetration into the thinking of the character. Okay, so this is from Flaubert. She repeated, "I have a lover, I have a lover," delighting at the idea as if a second puberty had come to her. So at last she was to know those joys of love, that fever of happiness of which she had despaired. She was entering upon a marvelous world where all would be passion, ecstasy, delirium. So what's sort of challenging about this is that we need to be able to separate between the narrative position, the narrative ideal, and the opinion and the point of view of the character. What's challenging about this is that free and direct discourse blends these two things, blends the narrative voice and blends the character the reflection, so that when the narrative gives us this idea that she was entering upon a marvelous world where all would be passion, ecstasy, delirium, that is from her point of view. She assumes that the act of taking a lover throws her into this world where all will be passion, ecstasy, and delirium. which may or may not be the case, and in fact turns out, of course, not really to be the case for her. So that's another example of free indirect discourse where the